Great. So,
Dolores and Alan, can you hear me?
yeah, hey,
I'm Ross Cochran, and I don't think I know you folks.
Well, nice to meet you.
Be careful getting to know Ross.
Where, where, where
Hey,
are you
Eric.
guys?
I'm sorry,
Where do you live?
Dallas.
Okay, all right. All over or one place in particular?
We just live in this one house
Yeah, just
in Lake Highlands area.
okay. Yeah. Okay, well, good. And Terry,
Ross,
Ross at
where do
I
you
think
live, Ross?
I live in, well, Searcy and Bentonville. I married a woman 3.5 years ago who raised her children here in Bentonville, and she has family and responsibilities both here and in Searcy, where I raised my kids. So we kept our houses and we're back and forth as needed. So
Well, we were just in your neighborhood on the weekend. Our grandson graduated from Arkansas, and we've spent a good amount of time in Bentonville too as we visited him, and really grown to love being in that area. Wished he'd have stayed in school, and so we could come up some more.
Yeah, I need to get him a grad program or something. Yeah.
he graduated?
Yeah.
How is that
Arthur did.
possible?
Yeah, he's supposed to be like 9 years old, right?
Golly. Ross Allen is one of the original, what were you guys labeled, Alan? Interns, Heartbeat interns?
Yeah, out of St. Louis with
in
Stanley and all that.
Out of St. Yeah. They lived in Lowell, Massachusetts.
Okay. You wouldn't have been involved in that program. Hey, Courtney, you wouldn't have been involved in that program when Jim Clark was, were you?
No.
Okay.
We were the first group through the internship, and then I was on staff the second year, and then we went up to Massachusetts with Landon, and he didn't come up, but we did was it Feeling Good About Yourself and your Element seminar and all the other things that the Heartbeat developed.
Well, listen, you guys, I want to introduce you to Courtney Farley. Courtney's joining us for the first time tonight. She's an outstanding graduate of Harding. She was our outstanding Bible major. Was it December or last May, Courtney?
Yeah, that was last May, actually.
Last May, a year ago. Okay, but she's now in Tucson doing an internship, a pastoral ministry internship with a campus ministry there in Tucson. So we were talking earlier today about texting about a call tomorrow, and I said, hey, you might really enjoy this. So I'm glad she's joining us tonight.
Great
to
to
have you, Courtney.
And Terry, I don't really know you. Where are you from, Terry?
We live in Santa Rosa Beach, Florida.
Okay.
My wife Diane has just joined me.
Okay.
Hey there.
We've been out on 38 today just to remember how bad it was when we lived out there for 20 years.
I don't think you can be on that road without being really, really crowded.
Oh, unbelievable. And the next week's when it really starts.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I bet.
There's Seth.
Come some more.
Hey, Seth.
Oh, how you doing? My sound coming through all right?
It is. Great to have you with us. Everyone, this is Seth Bushell, who's kind of our guest tonight of kind of speaker or conversationalist tonight. So we'll get into that here in just a few minutes. We'll wait and see if we got a few more folks join.
Seth, you and I have had one phone call
yes,
months and months ago.
It's nice to put a face for the name.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember correctly, Becky Kelly's your sister. Do I remember that?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, Becky would have been.
Oh, that's right. Becky would have been at Central when you were growing up down there.
That's
She
right.
absolutely
Yeah.
was. Yeah. So
Yeah.
Julie was the same age as my sister, and then David was a year behind me. So
Okay.
we grew up with all their kids.
Okay.
And you guys, this is Harrison Dell. Harrison's also joining us for the first time.
Hi, everyone.
So I just invited him. I think he and Kelly are people I think that are just because of the way they live their lives would have a lot of interest in this work. So, and then particularly what Seth has to say tonight, I thought might interest them. So, Harrison,
Right. Harrison, good to have you.
Yeah,
to have you guys.
thanks. Jerry, Kellen was my club president. If I don't know if you remember this stuff.
Yes.
I-
Okay.
We knew you were at Harding with.
Some of our kids.
Andy and I are pretty close in age, yeah, but
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah, Kellen was a senior when Tandy was a freshman.
Did you see? all
that
right?
sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I use Zoom so seldomly, I have to figure out all over again how to use this. So.
But we all started kind of become students of it, what, 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah. We were forced into it.
Yeah.
Somebody asked me when I retired a year ago, if you could go back, what would you do differently? I said I'd invest in Zoom stock. That's why.
Mm. Mm.
I think I would have bought Apple in the 90s.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Sure, for sure.
Consolation.
He does.
Oh.
He does.
Okay.
In fact, Alicia had that conversation.
Okay.
So, yeah. Well, we may still have a few people join, but I know we have a lot which I'm excited to talk about with Seth. So why don't we go ahead and get started, and as other people come in, if they do, that's fine. That's great. Normally Brian hosts this. He's trying to get to Italy right now, and so he asked me to be the host this week or whatever, moderator of this. And I am excited to do that. I got to spend some time about a week ago with Seth as we kind of prepared for this, and I think it's going to be a really good conversation. I had not really, Seth grew up in my hometown too of Amarillo, but I didn't really know him growing up. I've kind of just got to know him through his father, who I do know well and count as a friend, and then just recently through Landon. But Seth, as I mentioned, kind of grew up in Amarillo, went to ACU, then studied at Fordham, I believe. Is that correct, Seth?
Yes, sir.
And is a director of equipping for Exponent Group. And I'd really recommend, if I wasn't really familiar with that organization, I looked at their website. They do some really good stuff for churches and the work they're doing up there in the Northeast. I'd encourage you to look at that. He's authored 2 books, Lost Faith, A Practical Theology for Post-Christian Ministry, and Grieving God, which, Seth, I just got last week. I'm in chapter 3.
Oh,
And it's a challenge, I tell you. It's convicting. And he's also co-authored a book, Mosaic and Ministry Handbook for a Globalizing World, with Jared Looney, who I think you work closely with Jared.
I did.
Yeah. Seth lives in New York City, and for the past 11 years has been planting churches among the diverse group of folks that live in the 5 boroughs of the city. And so we're really excited to have him with us tonight. Thanks, Seth, for taking the time to do this.
Thanks for having me.
One of the things I think is really interesting is that Seth, the last couple of years of Landon's life, he and Landon would have a regular phone call if chemo and such allowed it, almost weekly, I think,
Yeah.
in which they talked about different things that I think has had an impact on Seth and his work. And so the first thing I want to do is just let Seth share with us a little bit about those calls, those conversations, and how that impacted his work, his ministry, his writings, and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. Let's see. So I met Landon when I moved to New York. Randy Harris had been my spiritual director for a good while. And so when I moved up to Northeast, he said, y'all really ought to meet. And so for the first probably 5 or 6 years, we would get together maybe once a year in New Haven, which was about halfway between us, and have dinner somewhere. And then he invited me a couple times up to Vermont to just hang out with him, which was a real treat. But yeah, it was really in the last couple of years of his life that he kind of reached out and asked if we would have a more regular conversation. And I think he was thinking through a lot, not only about his own legacy and work, but some of the conversations that we had had over the years about developing discipling relationships with people outside of kind of the traditional church. And we had started doing a lot of equipping work with congregations. And so in my own ministry, I was navigating how to translate, 7 or 8 years worth of church planting missionary experience back into the context of traditional church. And I think Landon was thinking about the same thing for his own work, especially as the Institute at ACU was forming, just thinking through what about this is impactful to a younger generation, and also a generation that's largely, if they haven't thought through leaving church, many of their peers have. And so it's a regular conversation people are having. And so a lot of our conversations centered around evangelism and what the spirituality of non-religious people is like. But I think also we talked a good deal about kind of the way that we felt like traditional church ministries often misunderstood the context we worked in.
Mm. That would be an interesting conversation. Any kind of insights in that particularly?
Oh, I think a few. I think the primary ones, the hard thing about being Landon's friend is he lets you be pretty selfish. And so I think especially as a minister, it was really nice to just have somebody ask me questions that I didn't feel a pastoral burden with, and just get to kind of be free flowing in my thinking in a way. And so when I reflect on my relationship with Landon, I'm like, gosh, I did so much of the talking. But I think the things that we had a lot of commonality around and came back to again and again. I think number one, people who have left faith are still deeply spiritual, and it is not hard to have spiritual conversations with them. And I think that was something that I very much found true in my own work, and struggled to train church folk to believe is true. And so Landon and I bonded a lot around that if you're able to have a deep conversation with a person, it is not hard for that to be a spiritual conversation. And the types of questions that Christians ask are normal questions for people to have conversations and interactions around. So I think that was a big one. I think the other one I'm especially struck, I remember asking him a question around why it is that so many of the ministers we work with have sort of a misconception around post-religious people. And I've been noticing that for most pastors, they have so many responsibilities. They don't have very many relationships outside of their congregation with non-Christians. And so I just asked him, I said, Landon, how many ministers do you know who have 2 or more non-Christian friends that don't attend their church? And he said, I can count them on one hand. And I think especially over the last few years, I've thought about that comment a lot. It really struck me as like, okay, that isn't something that we're just experiencing in our ministry. This person knows the broader church much better than I do, and it's uncommon in his experience as well.
Yeah, that's so true. Jimmy, Sarah, good to have you guys with us. Slipped in there. With that, and I think that's a good place I want to transition over and talk about some of these issues, though, as it ties to your book, Lost Faith, and kind of visiting that, because I think that just is a great flow of this continual conversation and such. And first of all, you use this title, with this term lost with faith, but in the book, you really define that differently than most of us do in Christianity and
Sure.
our churches. So first of all, tell us a little bit about what you mean by lost.
Yeah, well, for that book in particular, I wanted to start with sort of a profile of 5 different people in our ministry. Our church planting is among different immigrant populations in major cities like New York. And we plant really simple house churches with the expectation and hope that those are very reproducible by the people that come to faith in that environment. And so for a lot of people groups that are difficult to send missionaries to overseas, they live in large concentrations in places like San Francisco and New York and Singapore. And so if we can plant really simple churches in those communities, those people are capable of being church planters back through their own kind of lines of immigration. And so in trying to profile the diversity of who we work with, it was difficult to come up with a term that's a catch-all, because people talk about nuns, but what that means actually can be pretty subjective. That could be somebody that grew up in church and left. That could be somebody that's never attended church. In New York, they may have grown up Hindu or Muslim and are non-religious now. And so what I wanted to do was kind of profile a certain spiritual experience of most of who's in our church. which is that if you ask them what their religious identity is, they're at a loss for the answer. And a lot of the answer you get is, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, or I'm not a religious person, but I do also, have crystal meditation and go to these Buddhist retreats. And so I grew up with the term lost, and I think it was being juxtaposed with saved in the church I grew up in. And that wasn't really the way I wanted to use it. It's more of a sense of religious identity, religious belonging, and that those people have lost a category that they identify with in trying to describe themselves. And for many of them, they have an affiliation with the church, either in their own lifetime or in their family's lifetime, that has been lost. And so what kind of faith questions do those people ask? What have been meaningful practices for them in connecting with Jesus? Is kind of how I try to use the term.
And I kind of felt like in that you're also kind of identifying that we all can identify with having kind of lost something, maybe even something related to our identity. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, one of my maxims with our coaches, anybody who grows up in church has church hurt. And so I think it's one of the things that's really easy to relate to lost people about, is it's like, well, if they've had a negative religious experience, I'm fourth generation Church of Christ ministry. I've had a few too. And so I think part of using that language, I'll tell my coaches, it's like, you have to remember church people are lost people, or can be. And a lot of it is around a sense of, do I know who I am and what my purpose and mission and community is in the way that I'm pursuing my own spiritual life? And for a lot of people, the answer is no, but that doesn't necessarily affect how they fill out a census.
Yeah. Then you kind of move into this idea of discovery and shared seeking and shared questioning with folks. Tell us more about that and what that looks like.
Sure. I think most of the evangelism that I grew up watching, it violated a lot of social etiquette. And I think oftentimes I would see conversations happen and somebody that was in the evangelistic position kind of judge, like, well, this person's not spiritually receptive. And it's like, no, I think they just didn't want to talk to you. That's not the same thing. And so when we train in our evangelism, our first maxim we train, always say, if you can't have a conversation, you can't have a spiritual conversation. Meaning if talking to you makes people want to tie a millstone to their neck and hurl themselves into the sea, you should not expect to have a meaningful conversation with them. And so I think for a lot of people, particularly in a context like New York, they would rather talk than listen, and they would rather explain something to you than be a passive recipient of your knowledge and experience. And so a lot of what we tried to imitate, I think, was both identifying that in terms of just how social relationships function, and then also trying to be really critical and sensitive to the fact that when you're working cross-culturally as a white Christian, to be a teacher is to have a power dynamic, to have a power hierarchy in the relationship. And so a lot of the time when we were trying to interact, especially with our Muslim neighbors, we were not in a good position to get direct feedback about what they were thinking and hearing, because they were trying to honor us as teachers. And so you just end up in a lot of conversations where you're like, these people are being very polite and nice to me, but it's hard to have a mutual engagement. And so I think a lot of what we try to imitate comes from seeing the way that Jesus does evangelism and starts relationships with disciples, that they are participants in sort of inductively working out what it is he's saying and how it makes sense in their context. And so one of the ways that we do that, we talk about is beatitude evangelism, which is essentially to say, I don't know anybody who's so dysfunctional that they have no qualities that I respect. And so a lot of my evangelistic conversations, rather than trying to convince someone to be persuaded of something that's important to me as a Christian, why don't I honor and explicitly call out what I admire about them and try to ask them about how to develop that character trait in myself as a disciple? And so to say, you're a real peacemaker. I've noticed that the way that you are always mediating with people on the block. Here's a scenario going on in one of our house churches that's pretty frustrating right now. How would you advise me to make peace there? or to say, you know, you're a really generous person. I get asked for money a lot. I don't always know how to decide when to say yes. Where did you learn that? How do you make decisions in that space? And so these are very easy ways to get into deeper spiritual conversations that I think are non-coercive, but they start by treating the other person as having a life experience that's worth learning from, and that they will probably see things in scripture I don't see. They may understand subtext in the Bible that I don't pick up on because of my own cultural background. And so let me be a mutual learner in the way we start evangelistic conversations. And let me try to really leave them in the interpretive position rather than expecting they're sort of my passive theology student.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And got something going on somewhere.
Are you in New York City?
Yeah, that won't be the last time that happens tonight. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. As you move into the real core of the book, you talk about the three classic categories of theology: anthropology, what it means being a human, what that's like; Christology, what is Jesus like; and theology, what is God like. And you talk about how most of the time we start with God, then Jesus, and maybe we get to what it means to be a human. But you start with what it means to be human, and you feel very strongly about that approach.
I do.
And we were talking the other day. I said that sounds to me like Landon Saunders has got that all over that. So share with us why you feel so strongly about that. Why that's critical.
Yeah, there's a personal reason, and then there's one that I can pretend is strategic. So let me start with that one. I think when you look at sort of post-religious, the subculture of kind of post-religious people, a statistically high number of them believe in God. Actual full-on atheists are pretty rare statistically. And so most people that you're going to have a spiritual conversation with, it may not be all the time, but they kind of go through a general sense of believing in God. They just don't believe that scripture is a more authoritative revelation of God than their own experience. And so it's not the God of the Bible. It is almost sometimes this generic, you know, when you watch a Tom and Jerry cartoon and the cat gets hit by a bus and goes to heaven. Like, it can be quite generic, but that language is pretty familiar to people, and they're usually very comfortable with that. And so what they don't believe in is the God is revealed in scripture, but I don't know almost anybody that applies that same sense to Jesus. I don't know anybody who's like, yeah, I believe in Jesus, but not the Jesus of the Bible. And so I often find it's much easier to start with Jesus as a human being and talk about how imitating Jesus relates to our lived experience. And then let's see if we can't work backwards to what is Christ-like about God. And I don't find that too unorthodox, but I think on a more personal level, I think a lot of intimacy comes more out of shared weakness than shared strength. And a lot of evangelistic conversations come out of bonding with other people around our own kind of doubts, pain, disorientation, grappling with loss, uncertainty, ambiguity. And so to be willing to be very vulnerable about that as a disciple, because I'm deeply convinced that following Jesus has not removed, it's not isolated me from having the same negative experiences that all human beings have. You know, if anything,
Sure.
taking up a cross may make your life harder, not easier.
Mm-hmm.
And so to start with the lived experience of the other person and not assume what questions are important to them, to not assume what their religious experience is, or that they won't understand things in scripture unless I explain them to them. And I find that the easiest position, a lot of what I talk about with ministry, I think the best metaphor or image for ministry is to be a midwife. That our role is in the helping of the birth of this thing that God has already formed. But it's really important to remember that that's not my baby, and I didn't create that thing. I'm just the midwife in this relationship. And so how can I really become a collaborator and a facilitator of their relationship with the gospel rather than creating a teacher-student dynamic?
I love that metaphor. That's really, really good. As you kind of move through these next several chapters in the book, which we're just going to focus on that part where he talks about what it means to be human. And you talk about intimacy, which you've mentioned, and you talk about loneliness and those two poles and the importance of kind of both of those.
Yeah,
Can you share a little more about that?
I think so. Well, I was just having lunch with a minister today, and he was talking about how he works here in the city. He works cross-culturally as a church planner. They've been pretty successful, and he's now working part-time at another congregation nearby. And he said, I'm realizing in the last few months that I can kind of just fake it in terms of my own prayer life, and I would probably be just as successful and productive. But every time I sit down to pray, it feels like a waste of time because my mind is just on all these things that, don't have anything to do with the ministry. And it's like, yeah, I think that's why it's important that you do that, man. And I said, I can't think of a more important spiritual experience than that you would give God permission to waste your time. What an incredible reminder of how little control you actually have over any of this. And I bring that up to say, most ministers that I know are lonely. Most ministers I know have a lot of grief that is secondhand and almost no practices to deal with that. A lot of what I've done as a spiritual director is walk with ministers through that, and almost none of them have a regular practice to deal with the difficult emotional experiences that come out of ministry. And I think it is important for us to have some of these disciplines around solitude, around silence and not being available, around giving space to the grief that comes out of being a minister. Because I think there's a lot of work that God does in an interior space when we make time to process that in our own spiritual lives. But ministry won't reward prioritizing that. And it will seem unproductive most of the time. But I think a lot of the really important formation that keeps us emotionally healthy enough to kind of justify trying to make other disciples kind of lives in that space. People don't need a lot of help celebrating. Well, some people do, but I think a lot of those experiences that we treat as, well, if you had more faith, you wouldn't experience it this way, I think become windows of intimacy with Jesus. To say, okay, I feel like none of the people I'm discipling really understand me, and it feels lonely. Is that an emotional experience that Jesus has had? I go back to my hometown, and I feel like in everybody's eyes, you get put into this box as a young kid, and it's hard to preach in that space. Is that an emotional experience that Jesus has had? And so I think again and again, identifying those things as something that is a window into connecting with Jesus. It's not evidence of having done something wrong spiritually or being unfit for ministry. I think that's really important to model, especially for new disciples.
Good stuff. Then later in that segment, you kind of talk about these four fears: rejection, number one; number two, being hurt; number three, hurting others; and number four is death, but it's a spiritual death that you define differently. Can you kind of talk about that? What do you mean by this spiritual death that we fear?
Sure. Well, I expand on it a little bit in the follow-up book to this one. Grieving God is the follow-up one, and I think for so many of us, it's very easy to make an idol out of our own spirituality and our own ministry. And by an idol, I would say, you identify an idol as a story about reality that we kind of wish were true and try to make reality compete with. And so, to ask the question, will the kingdom of God lose anything when Exponent Group ceases to exist as a ministry? I don't think so, but that's very hard to admit, and it's something we should talk about in our staff meetings. Because if we start to feel like the decline of our ministry organization is a threat to the kingdom of God, all right, well, maybe our ministry is starting to become an idol. And similarly, we're shutting down a bunch of ministry programs in our network of gang affiliated churches. So we've got about 200 kids in the West Bronx that are part of different programming for gang affiliated kids between 11 and 23. But the missionary that planted all that has to go back home to take care of her grandmother who has dementia. And so we're going to keep the house churches, but lose a lot of the programming. That feels like a death. I don't think the kingdom of God loses anything in that, but it's really hard after 10 years to shut things down that have been going well. And it raises a lot of questions about the relevancy of your work, about the long-term impact of your work. And I think to grapple with the way in which what we imagine our ministry should become easily becomes an idol. And vision is important, but it's also very dangerous. And I think part of what the gospel calls us to in terms of, if you try to save your life, you'll lose it. If you're willing to lose your life, you'll find it. I think that's true about our organizational missions in life as well. And I don't have the expertise to list them here, but I mean, we're probably all aware of the major church failures that have happened over the last few decades. And at the center of almost every one of them is the idea that, well, this institution was too big to fail, so we couldn't address moral and leadership failures without putting the institution in jeopardy. And I just think that thinking is completely absent from how Jesus leads.
Yeah. I actually, that chapter was the chapter I was reading this morning, Seth. It was kind of a downer, I'll have to tell you. I had to struggle with some stuff in that. Man, it was good.
Yeah, well, I think almost nothing in nature is evaluated in terms of its health by how long it lives. You can't say that a tortoise is healthier than a fruit fly because it lives 200 years. Almost everything in nature is evaluated in terms of its health by whether it can healthily reproduce. And I think when we talk about church health, I think growth is an insufficient metric to evaluate the health of an institution. Almost nothing self-reproduces more efficiently than cancer. And so to be like, it's growing, it's like, well, that doesn't mean it's healthy. And so I think for a lot of the things in terms of our own ministry, I want to evaluate, it's on how healthily does that reproduce when a new disciple implements that in their own life. When a new disciple tries to do this in relationship, can they healthily reproduce what we were seeking to be as missionaries and as ministers? And if the answer is no, that may be a strategic problem, but that also may be the result of my own ego and desire for control.
This is great, Seth. I could keep going and on, but I want to open it up to everybody else to have a chance to ask questions, make comments about what we've talked about, those kind of things. So kind of the floor is open. You guys jump in.
Yeah, I don't mind being one of those people that goes first. Does that
Great,
help?
Harrison. Appreciate it.
Well, you said Randy Harris was your spiritual director for a lot of years at ACU. So I imagine you've heard the story where he told, I just went and tried to listen to Randy there's not enough podcasts out there
I've never heard anyone say that.
with Randy Harris. Like,
okay.
My apologies.
Maybe I need to look better. But where I was, he said he was out knocking on doors. This is about a comment you made 10 minutes ago, but he was out knocking on doors with another person who told the lady who answered, do you know that if you died tomorrow, you'd go to hell? And she promptly invited him to go first. That was the story that Randy Harris told in a sermon one time. I always thought his big takeaway from that sermon was there's got to be more to this. And so I was thinking about that story just because you're I know you got a lot of love for Randy Harris, but his whole point was to say that in terms of evangelism, it's going to have more to do with proximity, who you're sharing life with, who you work with, and those with whom you interact with day to day at home and in your
I
work.
think a lot of that's true. I have a strange enough personality that I enjoy evangelism with strangers, but in terms of equipping other church people to do that, that's a rare profile.
Mhm.
I actually think the skills of evangelism are fairly easy to learn. We work with probably between 6 and 10 churches a year doing equipping cohorts, and those last about 8 months. Within about a 12-month period, I think most people who will practice seriously can develop a pretty natural form of evangelism that's appropriate to their personality and social wiring. The
Mhm.
really difficult thing long term is not evangelistic skills, it's the emotional self-management. The not turning the other person into a source of validation for us as the evangelist. Not using the ministry interaction as a form of validation and affirmation. It's
Or
tremendous.
self-soothing with my own struggle with what I've not done to answer the Great Commission.
Yeah.
It's a similar side of the same coin of validation, but
Yeah. I mean, you have to really grow a sense of emotional resilience to feeling irrelevant. And that's especially hard for young seminarians who come to the mission field. I think over and over again, I've watched the best evangelists, and it's part of why we made some changes in our own ministry, but new disciples are often better evangelists than new seminary graduates. New seminary graduates feel a tremendous pressure to be everybody's teacher and explain the things they spent the last 4 years learning. Whereas I find new disciples are pretty good about saying, like, I don't know any other Bible stories besides this one, so I just have questions about this one.
Good point. Somebody else.
I'll ask Seth. Thank you for this, by the way. Really a lot to process here. What are you finding about folks who don't think of themselves as people of faith or don't know exactly what they mean by that? Or if they separate from church or when they do, what are they doing for community, and how does their faith get nurtured?
I would say it is very dependent on context. And so I can speak to a little bit of that in the Bronx. But I would say on average, I don't find that they have less community than people that attend church regularly. But I think in New York, depending on the community you're working in, a lot of them will either have extended family systems if they grew up in the city, or they may have a surrounding diaspora community. So, going to Chinatown, even if you have no family in town, if you are a first generation Chinese immigrant, that is a connection with community, that is a connection home. And so I think a lot of it takes place through those kind of diaspora networks. A lot of the early communities I got plugged into were through a craft beer brewery that was the first brewery in the Bronx that opened up. And it was like 5 minutes from my house. And so that was a good place for community because it closed at like 9 p.m. So it only attracted more of the like Cheers vibe of like everybody's going to come in, have 2 beers and go home rather than like be here till 3 a.m. And so I think a lot of those third spaces are where it takes place in New York. I find that's very hard in more car-based cities. I think a lot of people who are in more sprawled out commuter cities, there are not as many good third spaces because you can't, you pretty much have to go everywhere intentionally. You don't pass by a lot of things that you can stop at on the highway. And so like for me, I can walk into a coffee shop, a bakery, or a bar between the train station and my house, but those would be different trips if I still lived in Dallas. And so I think third space, sports leagues, those kind of things. But honestly, like most of the churches that we've had that would fit the description I just gave are more first generation immigrants. a lot of the second and third generation in the diaspora that have maybe left faith really struggle with community. And the way we plant churches, we plant around a person of peace concept is what we call it. We take that language from Matthew 10 and Luke 10 when Jesus sends out the 72, that they and their whole household hear the gospel. And the position of the disciples is as guest, not host. And so what that means for us practically is if I have a good evangelistic interaction with somebody and they ask to come to church with me, the answer is no. It's like, I'm not bringing you to church with me, but if you'll go gather the people that you want to be in community with, I will help you start a church there. And so all of our house churches planted that way. And for most of, at least the people of peace that I've worked with over the years, when they gather their community, it's like 12 people that don't know anybody else in the room except the person that gathered them. And so a lot of times their community is highly networked, but those people don't know each other. And they've kind of cobbled together community. But what that means is more, I have a relational network, not that this is a network of people who are interconnected beyond their association with me. And so a lot of our house churches, the first year or so is a lot of relationship building because they're having to learn to be a community at the same time they're learning to be a church, which is different than, say, working in the Bengali community where a patriarch can put 20 family members in a room and they may be learning the gospel for the first time, but they know what it means to be a community already.
Just to be clear, when you say third spaces, you mean something besides home and work?
Indeed. Yes, sir.
Okay.
And so, yeah, there's a lot of that in New York, just because of the design of the city. And it's much more socially appropriate here to engage strangers for that reason. Whereas I actually feel a little annoyed if somebody in Starbucks in Abilene is talking to me. I sort of expected it here, and I don't know how to account for the difference.
Someone else.
I can ask a question next. So, for some context, I'm in Tucson, Arizona, and I just joined a new church plant and a campus ministry here with the U of A, and we have 50,000 students that go to that school, and the church launched in September. And so our crowd really is half Church of Christ people who have grew up in the church, know all the things, that's their norm. Half students coming from over 12 different countries who are either new to faith or not yet won over to Jesus.
Sure.
And those two groups come into the room, and kind of the divide that I'm seeing is one side, what you talked about, where it's that trajectory of people, Jesus, God. One side sees it as that. And the other side is seeing it as, well, if we don't teach doctrine and we don't teach God first, like, our integrity is lost and our
Sure.
faith is threatened. And so I've been observing that this semester and wondering, like, how do you get those groups of people who show up every week, like they're committed? How do you get those groups of people to see unity in a way that's more life-giving, and also to see discipleship as something that doesn't have to be a threat to faith if you don't get here a certain time or a certain way?
Sure.
How do you let those people, the one side especially, who sees like not teaching doctrine as a threat to faith, how do you get them to maybe see that context and that person as a person, first of all, and differently?
Well, yeah, that's going to be difficult. I'll be honest with you. I think there's a couple things at play there potentially. I don't know your church, but just out of my own experience, there's a couple things that might be at play there that I would characterize more as a formational issue than a strategic one. And I think one is, for a lot of church folk, evangelism is not actually motivated by a love of neighbor. It is motivated by a desire to turn our neighbor into something lovable to us. And Landon and I used to talk about this a lot, but I'm going to start with the theological conviction that the person I'm talking to is not going to decide or become or believe anything that is going to make them more loved by God. And so with that as a starting position, let me engage them that way. Let me engage them as someone who is already as loved as they're going to be. And the discipleship process for me starts whenever we start having dialogue about the gospel. But we never arrive in discipleship. We're all still continuing to grow into the full stature of Christ, hopefully. And so I always joke around, like, I don't know when the disciples converted. I know, let's say Mark 8 is halfway through Jesus's ministry. At that point, only 1 out of 12 is calling him Christ, and he's getting called Satan. So that's not a great track record. The last conversation the apostles have with an earthly Jesus, they say, is now the time you're going to restore the kingdom of Israel? It's like, nope, here's the keys. And he, ascends to heaven. And so I don't have a sense of when they convert, but I know when they start doing ministry, and it's at the very beginning. He sends them out very early in his ministry before they come to any kind of clear and full understanding who he is. And then along the way, he's asking, who do you think I am, based on what you're experiencing? And I think we struggle to extend to other people the kind of hospitality Jesus shows to his own disciples, to be in process. It's very hard for us to allow other people to be in process rather than come to the conclusions we have immediately. And that's not fair or loving to our neighbor, I don't think. So I guess that would be one. I also think it's really important for us not to be more anxious about the mission of God than God is. That often is a good indicator of when our faith has started to become idolatrous. It's like, is God anxious about the mission and the coming of his kingdom? And it's like, well, I don't think so. So where is all this anxiety and urgency in me coming from? Because that's not a reflection of how God feels. And I think a lot of work that we're going to do when we're doing church equipping with teams, again, it's on that emotional self-management. Okay, what is causing a sense of anxiety and urgency about where this person is at in their faith formation? Does that indicate that I've taken on an unhealthy role in terms of what my level of responsibility is to control other people's speed of faith formation? I say a lot. I'm a big believer in baptism, so don't hear me say anything else. But I think of baptism similar to a wedding. It's not the beginning or culmination of a relationship. It's a really important transition in the life of a larger relationship. And pushing somebody to move up the wedding and pushing somebody to move back the wedding can both be unhealthy depending on what's going on in that person's life. But I think for us, a lot of times, to get to the end of a rambling answer that I apologize for, I think for me, if I had to pick who to prioritize, it would be the person that's not yet a disciple. If I anger a Christian and they go to another church, they're not going to leave faith. But if I convince a new disciple that their experience and emotions and questions are not valued until they reflect what mine are, then I think that I've committed ministerial malpractice.
That's good. That's really good. Courtney, you got to follow up?
I was definitely taking notes. I think it's really cool. Just a little bit of context too. My husband was at a conference last week, and he works with a lot of religious leaders of different faith. And one testimonial that you made me think of was this Christian leader was talking to a crowd this week and sharing how a rabbi, who is his friend, is one of the first people he thinks of when he thinks of people who show the qualities and the likeness of Jesus. And somebody in the crowd was recording that and sent that video to the rabbi. And she replied and she was like, "I am weeping." And the phrase that he took with that was not about like some Christians may see that rabbi and be like, "Man, like I wish they were following Jesus. Like I wish they would convert." I don't like using that word, but Anyway, but what they were encouraging us to think about was it's not that you think of, but rather the question is, what is the Spirit already doing in their life that makes us see that fruit? And how do I participate with that? How do I collaborate with it? How do I cheer that on? Because like you said earlier, it's not what we're doing. If our ministry goes away, like God's mission doesn't end.
Yeah.
So I
totally agree.
how that all came together, and I think it's really, really important. And so I'm thankful for what you're sharing today.
I appreciate that. To tie it back into Landon, we used to talk about this a lot. I think I stole a lot in my approach to evangelism from Peter Falk's character in Columbo. But I think a lot of my best spiritual conversations are often with somebody I've met before. And I'm going to tell them whatever theological rock is in my shoe and just ask them to help me process it. And so I remember one time we were reading the parable of the shrewd manager at a house church. And our last two questions at house church are always, okay, how can we put this into practice and who can we share this with? Because that's really the metric I want to evaluate with new disciples. Okay, let's find practical ways to put this into practice in our lives and then see what we learn about Jesus from doing that. And then who can we share with? I expect new disciples to do evangelism very early, which means they're not going out as teachers, they're going out as learners. And so when they get frustrated with the Bible or when they get confused by the Bible, it's like, okay, great. Why don't you go tell that story to 6 people and see what they think about it? And then we'll come talk about that next week. And maybe they'll have heard something we didn't hear. So we were reading Shrewd Manager and everybody at house church is like, this story's dumb. I don't know what this is about. And so I was like, well, I'll talk to my friend June about this. So I mentioned him in all my writing. But one of my best friends grew up very involved in the drug trade and gangs in the South Bronx. I did a memorial for his mother my first year in the Bronx. She was a santera, which is basically a voodoo priestess. And like June loves to interpret Bible stories. And he is a car mechanic. And I have watched him. He will sit there all day and just repeat the same 2 parables I told him the weekend before to everybody coming in for an auto inspection. And he's like, what do you think this story's about? And he's not a Christian at all. Like, he's just genuinely finding this an interesting conversation. So I was like, I'll go talk to Juno with this. And I go tell him the parable. And he's like, oh, this is simple. You're going to feel dumb when I explain this to you. I'm like, okay, what's this parable about? And he goes, this is exactly like the drug trade. I was like, okay. And he goes, you work on consignment. And so you're trying to sell things for more than they cost you, but you have to pay off the actual person you work for after you make all these sales. And he said, how many times have you watched me have to rescue my brother from under a debt? And I'm like, I've seen him do that a few times. And when he does, he has to go to the person. He's like, how much does my brother owe you? They'll be like, he owes me $10,000. And I say, here's 6. If I promise you that my brother will never work in this neighborhood again, are we good? And he's like, yep, we're good. And he goes, that's your story. And I was like, okay. So what is that supposed to teach about God? And he's like, well, somebody's going to have to sacrifice their own well-being and earning in order to make sure that these relationships go back together. Because as long as that debt is unpaid, his boss can't do any business because everybody knows that he doesn't collect his debts. And nobody can do any business with people that owe money because they know they don't pay their debts. And the only way to resolve that is violence. So you need somebody that's willing to not make a profit so that everybody can go back into relationship together. And it's like, okay, I didn't grow up in a world where the way to resolve debt was violence. But I think he's right about that story. I think that's exactly what's happening there. That economic relationships have broken down in a way that they need a mediator to heal this. And so he starts giving me all these, instances of like, well, when you gave money to this person, and it's like, okay, he understands this story. He doesn't need me to be his teacher about what this is. And he's enriching my understanding of something important to my faith because I bothered to ask how he hears it. And I think there's a lot of, that's a long example, but I think to come in as a learner in the evangelistic position and to say, what does this person see in scripture that I don't see? What might they pick up on and draw my attention to that I'm not sensitive enough to hear? And that's not only how I would determine who has ears to hear the gospel, but it helps me be a better evangelist in my own context. And I think it was something I really learned from and admired about Landon, that when you would talk to him about spiritual conversations with people, it was never moments of like, and then I said this so well, and like I really impacted them as a teacher in this way. It was, I think, a very Christ-like willingness to discover about this other person what God was already doing in them. To your point.
Good. Ross, you seem to really enjoy that. You got any thoughts?
No, I just thank you. I love the idea of coming in as listener.
Yes.
Learning.
Yes. I remember Landon was the first person I think I heard say, when you come to somebody, God is already there. They are created in his image. His image is already within them, and it just changed your whole view of another person.
Yeah.
Also makes me want to go back and watch Columbo reruns.
Yeah. Terry, my wife is all for that. She's a big Columbo fan.
Well,
anybody else got something before we wrap this up?
Just one thing. I'm mindful of what Courtney was talking about, the two different groups that have different points of view, and how we're going to, that we're trying to figure out how we can have a similar point of view, similar process maybe of thinking or adjudicating, or a similar idea of truth. Dolores and I have lived in this neighborhood for about 25 plus years. We've probably seen it turn over about 3 times. And in the last 6-8 years, what we've seen is a bunch of, let's say, 35-year-old couples with 2 to 3 children move in. I mean, a bunch. And we have a completely different neighborhood. They have in common that a lot of them go to the same church or similar types of backgrounds. And they're really excited to be on the street to kind of be the same together. And unfortunately, about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, one of the couples down the street woke up one morning and their youngest child did not wake up, a year-old kid. And it was quite traumatic. And we all ended up in their front yard. And you've got all these, like I say, 35-year-old people go to church that they are not out, they're really tremendous individuals. And, I'm just sitting here looking at them, and Dolores and I are the token grandparents here. She's the cookie maker. And I'm honestly just the crotchety old gentleman that tries not to be an ass, unsuccessfully most days. But I said, guys, you guys thought you were moving to this neighborhood to kind of enjoy the fellowship of one another and to kind of be the same and to kind of love this. This is why you moved into the neighborhood. This is what your purpose is, to be here. The question is, how are we going to love this family? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? My point, Courtney, is we think in a church, we think in these groups that our goal and our highest, best use is to try to figure out how to talk about the truth the same. And actually, our highest, best use is always to figure out how to love one another when the shit hits the fan and when life really happens. And frankly, I think it's, I'm a guy who's tried to do a lot of this stuff, and it's amazing how difficult it is to get people to change their minds, to evolve their point of view, to even understand another point of view. At the same time, it's really not hard to say, okay, how are we going to love with one another when life happens? And that's if we're not doing that, then what we're doing is just a mental exercise.
Yeah, I say a lot that I would like to be like Jesus in that if I go to a party, people are happy I'm there. And I think doctrine is not unimportant, but nowhere in Scripture was I called to love my doctrine. I was called to love my neighbor, and that doesn't mean sacrificing the things I believe, but there are gentler and humbler ways to hold that, and I think the need to constantly persuade and be right is almost always a manifestation of insecurity. I've never met anyone who is deeply emotionally mature that acted that way.
Good.
One other quote, Seth, to bounce on you. I forgot the gentleman's name. He writes a lot of books on successful living. This is my 70-year-old moment. But he was asked, what's the key to a successful marriage? And he said, not having to be right.
I think we would probably all amen that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Before we go, I told Seth I was going to ask him this because it's something I used to ask Landon pretty regularly. And when I have lunch with Seth's dad about once a year, I always ask him this. And I want to ask Seth this. Share with us 2 good book recommendations.
Sure. Let's see. In terms of spiritual formation, I really like Timothy Gallagher's book, The Discernment of Spirits. I had that book at Fordham, and it's around kind of Ignatian spirituality and discernment. And I think growing up in the Church of Christ, I didn't hear us talk a lot about discernment. And I don't remember us having any practices around it other than intercessory prayer and just studying. And so I think having some more practical tools on like, how do you teach new Christians how to listen to God? And how do you teach them how to apply some self-criticism around, was that the motivation of God, or maybe that's our own sort of emotional immaturity telling us to do that thing. I think that was a tremendously helpful one. Justo Gonzalez has a book called Mañana. It's kind of theology from a Latino perspective. And I found that one of the most helpful resources. The Bronx is about 60% Latino. And so it's just been a large cultural learning process for us in terms of thinking about navigating that community as missionaries. There's, almost everybody historically has a link to the Catholic Church, but the diversity of people's faith experience is vast. And so I found that a really helpful resource for thinking about the ways that the gospel can be heard differently than the culture I grew up in and not be wrong.
Excellent. Very good. Seth, thank you so much. This has been really good.
Happy to.
Yeah,
Can I make a shameless plug?
And thank you,
Yeah,
everybody. Yes, but thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight, too. Yes, go ahead.
So one of the things we do, I wear kind of 2 hats. We have our own church planting ministry in New York, and then we also work with congregations in equipping. We have kind of 2 main pathways for that. One is on spiritual formation, one is on evangelism and spiritual conversations outside of the church. Those are monthly meetings that we have cohorts of kind of 8 to 10 people in. If you or anybody in your church would be interested in being a part of those, we have some scholarshiping set aside, so this is not a play for financial resources for our ministry, but just as people who love Landon, and I think may already culturally align with some of what we're talking about, if that would benefit you or any of your people, let me know, and I'd be very happy to invite you into one of those cohorts when they start up.
Great. And you guys soon, I think you can learn more about that at y'all's website, Exponent.
Exponentgroup.org. Yes,
yeah, exponentgroup.org. Great. No, thank you for sharing that. Thank you, everyone, for this. This has been rich. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Night, everybody. Thank you.